This video is brought to you by Nebula. Colombia is the unfortunate title holder of Latin America's longest-running conflict, one that has also been among the most deadly in the region. For 60 or so years, a multifaceted civil war involving the Colombian government, leftist guerrilla groups, right-wing paramilitaries, and organised crime groups has killed hundreds of thousands of people, saw tens of thousands kidnapped, and millions displaced. A 2016 peace deal with the country's largest rebel group was a major milestone, but did not mark an end to violence in the country, as splinter factions and other groups continued the fight. But in 2022, Colombia elected Gustavo Petro, himself a former guerrilla fighter, as the country's first leftist president, having campaigned on a promise to pursue a policy of paz total, or total peace. This was obviously an ambitious policy, and one that in his first year in office brought about mixed results. However, as we'll cover in this video, recent months have seen peace negotiations falter, with a series of violent incidents, leaving the prospect of total peace seeming ever more distant. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Let's start with some history. 1948 saw the beginning of a 10-year civil war known as La Violencia, or the Violence, which pitted the Liberal Party and its allied militia groups against the Conservative Party and its allies. This ended in 1958 with a power-sharing agreement that established a rotating Conservative-Liberal government called the National Front. But the government's exclusionary nature, coupled with dissatisfaction over persistent, particularly land-related inequality and limited reforms, contributed to the formation of various Marxist rebel groups in the 1960s, inspired by Cuba's recent revolution. Most notable was the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, which emerged from rural peasant self-defense groups and militant communists, and grew to be the largest of the organizations fighting a guerrilla war against the government. There was also, among others, the National Liberation Army, or ELN, which was more urban than FARC and comprised leftist intellectuals, students, and Catholic radicals espousing liberation theology. Anyway, to finance their operations, these groups relied on a range of income streams including kidnapping, ransom, and extortion, taxing the areas they controlled, and involving themselves in the booming drug trade, cocaine in particular. But alongside the growth of these leftist guerrilla groups was the emergence of right-wing paramilitaries, often with links to the Colombian state and military, in defense of powerful landowners against the guerrillas. Like with the guerrillas, the drug trade also served as a lucrative income stream for the paramilitaries. Over the decades of violence, there have been multiple attempts to negotiate an end to the conflict, with mixed results. For example, in the 1980s, the government negotiated the demobilization of 3 guerrilla groups. But while some fronts were demobilized, the conflict continued as negotiated attempts to end the FARC and ELN insurgencies failed. In fact, by the late 1990s, FARC was at its peak, with an estimated 20,000 or so fighters. 2002 saw the election of Álvaro Uribe to the presidency. Having pledged to pursue a hardline counterinsurgency strategy, he boosted Colombia's military, with financial backing from the US, ultimately aiming to militarily suppress the leftist rebels. The campaign severely weakened FARC, but was marred by widespread human rights abuses, including thousands of cases of false positives, i.e. the killing of innocent civilians later passed off as dead rebels. However, the weakening of FARC provided a fresh impetus for peace negotiations, with the group pledging to end kidnapping for ransom in 2012, and agreeing to resume peace talks with the Colombian government, now led by Uribe's successor. Eventually, in August 2016, the two sides announced that they'd reached a deal that would bring an end to FARC's more than half-century insurgency. Things weren't exactly smooth sailing from there, though, as the peace deal was put to the Colombian people for approval in a referendum in October, and it was narrowly rejected with just over 50% voting against, as opponents, led by ex-President Uribe, viewed it as too lenient on the leftist rebels. Following this rejection, the government and FARC went back and quickly made some revisions to the agreement, and, rather than hold another referendum, sent the new version to Congress, where it was approved. Despite the poor implementation of the peace deal by the next president, FARC largely disarmed, and the peace process continued. But Colombia's internal conflict didn't end as other groups filled the void and expanded. The ELN, for example, remained active and consolidated and gained territory, while several ex-FARC members who opposed the peace deal continued their insurgency under the FARC-EMC banner. FARC's dissolution also left room for the Gaitanistas, or the AGC, a powerful criminal gang or drug cartel that initially emerged decades ago out of the supposedly demobilized paramilitaries. It's worth pointing out that as well as fighting the state, these groups have also been fighting each other for control of land and resources. So skip ahead to 2022 and Gustavo Petro is elected president, promising to pursue a total peace policy, which aims to finally end Colombia's internal conflict through parallel negotiations with all armed groups. So how is this going? Well, the most progress has been made with the ELN, with whom the government agreed a 6-month ceasefire back in August 2023, which has since been extended until August this year, with the group agreeing to stop kidnappings for ransom. However, talks were thrown into crisis when the ELN announced in May that it would resume kidnappings and accused the government of failing to live up to its promises. Evidently, kidnapping is a persistent obstacle in peace talks with the ELN, but there are signs that progress, albeit slow, is still being made. For example, last week the government and ELN signed the first of 6 accords on the negotiation agenda. But when it comes to other armed groups, the news is less good. A ceasefire with the EMC, made up of ex-FARC dissidents, was partially suspended in several provinces back in March, and the group has recently carried out a number of deadly attacks. This highlights one of the main challenges of dealing with the EMC. Far from being a unified organisation, it's an internally fractured group with different fronts, some participating in negotiations and others not. In relation to the latter groups, President Petro has said that the offensive against them is total, showing that alongside his policy of dialogue, Petro is also turning to some of the more militaristic tactics of some of his predecessors. As for the AGC, the country's largest and most well-armed cartel, progress has been limited due to a number of hurdles, not least the fact that there's been legal obstacles in dealing with the group because it's not considered a political organisation like the ELN and EMC, but instead is simply a criminal one. The problem with the AGC being on the outside of the peace process is that it disincentivizes the other armed groups, which are rivals of the AGC, from negotiating their own demobilization, as disarming is not an appealing move if the well-armed drug cartel you've been battling with sees it as an opportunity to expand. So, looking at all this and considering that Petro is nearly halfway through his single 4-year term, the prospect of total peace looks unlikely. Partial peace may be achieved, perhaps through a deal with the ELN, for example. But even then, the challenge will be to avoid repeating what happened after 2016, where other armed groups simply fill the vacuum. That's not the end of the story though, and if you want to continue learning more, then check out Nebula News. Nebula News is our joint venture with Nebula, where the TLDR team curates a selection of videos that matter most in the world right now. No more feeling out of touch or not knowing what to say at events. On Nebula News, we help guide you through the news that matters most, using videos from a huge variety of creators, helping you find stories that matter and avoiding burnout. It's not just curated news content brought to you directly by us. Nebula also features loads of exclusive original content. That's things like Real Life Law's brand new series War Room, which every month runs you through a whole load of ongoing conflicts, keeping you in the loop. You can also watch every TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in many instances before they land on YouTube. Now, if you're already subscribed to Nebula, you can find the brand new Nebula News section at nebula.tv/news. And be sure to bookmark or save that link so you can use it as your TLDR-ified news homepage. If you're not a member already, then click the link in the description to sign up now. If you do, you'll get 40% off an annual plan by using our link. That's less than £2 a month. Plus, Nebula will know that you came from us, which really helps us out.